This is just another video to look at the assignment which I've put together because of the weather. As you know, that since the second week on the module we've actually been looking at this at the end of the session every week, and we've been building up the different areas of the assignment. So we know we've got to produce a 1500 word report. It's a business report and you can use headings. What we don't use is I's and we's. You need to make sure that you do refer back to the assignment brief, because that gives you the full details and that also shows you how marks are allocated. You need to use theory and you need to reference things correctly. So as we know from previous discussions, we're actually building up on the success of the 5p charge on the disposable carrier bags, and we've seen a drastic reduction in use of these. So the government are looking at rolling it out, and they're considering making a charge, possibly a tax, on single-use plastic containers such as takeaway boxes. It could be coffee cups, it could be your polystyrene things from a takeaway shop. And actually they're seeking further evidence. The government have produced a report on this, and I would really encourage you to actually download that report, to use it and to reference it. So we know that we're using economic theory to respond to the following questions on single-use plastic containers. So we're saying, why will an increase in price, why may it affect demand? And then the second thing we're looking at, the government often intervenes in the economy in the case of market failure. Is this a question of market failure? So do make sure that in your conclusion you do actually answer that last piece. Is it a case of market failure? And these are the areas you should consider. Now all of these slides, as you know, are on the assignment tab, and I think it's called Assignment Guidance or Assessment Guidance. So the first thing you know, as I've been saying for a number of weeks here, is you've got to read the story. You've got to get to know the story. I gave you some examples which are here on the sheet. You've got to read them. You need to read around the story. Get yourself really familiar with what's being said. The second thing, think about the task. Actually think about what economic theory we're going to use. All of these things we've actually covered in classes. Remember though, we don't actually reference things from slides. We reference from books. So we start off with the introduction, and the percentages is the percentage of marks I would actually be allocating to each section. It's also the suggestion of the percentage of words as well. So in this first introduction, worth 10%, tell me what the story is all about with references. So you've carried out the reading. You know what the government are trying to do. You know about the success of the single-use plastic containers, the carrier bags. Tell me about it. Talk to me about the government report. This is where you can actually outline the story. So if I've got no idea what's going on, at the end of this 150 words, I actually have an idea of what's happening. I don't want any personal thoughts. I don't care if you agree with it or disagree with it, because what you're doing is putting a piece of academic research together. This is actually probably the easiest 10% you can gain, providing of course you're reading. The second area, the pricing mechanism, and we're looking about 30%. And again, this is probably the area we've gone over the most in the class. So tell me about it. Explain to me what supply is. Explain to me that as the price of a product or a service is more expensive, more people want to supply that because you can make a lot of profit on it. But equally, if you go down to the other extreme and you say the cheaper the price or product, the less businesses want to supply it. So actually the supply drops. They don't actually want to supply it, and perhaps they'll supply something differently. Tell me about demand. Tell me that demand is our demand, is the consumer demand for a product or a price. And actually, when this product or price is expensive, our demand is really small. But actually, as the price gets down, it drops. Our demand for this grows. Tell me about it like this. Talk to me about equilibrium, about where these two curves meet. Do me a diagram. Talk to me about surpluses and shortages. Again, a diagram. Shifts and movements. Explain that movements are to do with price and shifts are to do with other determinants of demand. And again, a diagram. Elasticity. Talk to me about PED. Is it inelastic or elastic? What's the equation? How do we know if something's inelastic or elastic? Now, in this circumstance, we don't know what the answer is. It depends. So it's up for you to actually make a decision on the evidence you're getting. Is it elastic or inelastic? Explain to me which one you think it is and why. Now, draw me a diagram, but remember that on your demand curve, you actually need to be shown this demand curve at the right angle, depending on how elastic it is. Any of these things, go back to the slides, go back to the videos, if you don't quite understand it. But then, so what? Make it relevant to the task. Don't just give me theory about all this supply and demand. Make it relevant to the task. If the price increases of a product in a plastic container, let's say a takeaway from a takeaway shop, what's going to happen? If the increase in price, will we actually see a drop in sales and consumption? Talk to me about shifts. Why might it shift? We talked about things like fashion, about taste as a determinant of demand, that perhaps some sort of campaign could actually encourage people to actually change, to make this shift. Talk to me about the determinants of demand in PED and substitutes. So this is an area which will have about 5 diagrams to it. It needs to be properly referenced, and it's worth about 30%. Now, each of the things here indicated on the slide, this is what I will be looking at when it comes to marking you. So if you miss areas out, then you're going to really miss out on opportunities. If you miss out diagrams, you're certainly going to be missing out on marks. Then we looked at the market structure a few weeks ago, and we're looking at this being worth about 10%. So we actually had our diagram, we looked at market structure, how it summarised things up. We thought about the perfectly competitive market, where we had goods and services which were quite elastic. And if you remember, we went along the line, at the other end of the line, we had the pure monopoly, and we had everything which was inelastic. We talked about monopolistic competition. We talked about entries into the market. So we said, actually, if there's lots of firms in the market, if they're selling a similar product, if it's very, very easy to enter that market, then actually we were looking about this monopolistic competition, and we spoke about things like takeaway shops and builders. We then spoke about things like oligopolies, where there was few companies in the market, and how perhaps they colluded together, how they kept the price of things so similar, and we thought about things like banks on the interest rates. And you need to be talking to me about the market structure, but make it relevant to the task. So if you think about the organisations concerned, and you example, for example, coffee cups, you may talk about, as an example, not a whole assignment, on say Costa or Starbucks coffee. And you may actually say, well, this market is an oligopoly. Few companies in the market. I mean, you've probably got Costa and Starbucks and Cafe Nero and McDonald's. They're probably perhaps the big companies in this oligopoly. You could talk about those, and actually you could identify them on that market structure. Of course, as a by-the-by, I'm sure in your reading you've all found out now that Starbucks have already now added a tax, added a charge on the cost of these disposable containers. We already know that they give a discount if you bring your own container in. So this is the sort of thing you can talk to me about. You might want to give another example. You might think about takeaway shops and how it might affect them and where they are in the market. And perhaps we might think about those as being monopolistic competition. Whatever you decide, make sure you make it relevant. And then on the final week, we looked in detail about market failure. And this is worth 40%, so it's quite a big chunk of the assignment. And before the video took place, so before the seminar took place, there were 5 videos for you to watch. So there's 5 videos, you can go back and watch them again and again and again. And then we built up from them in the seminar session. And again, as you know, there's a video on that as well. So this is where you should be talking to me about the externalities, about the social costs, the social benefits. Show me with a diagram, but make it relevant. Has the market failed? Why has the market failed? We talked in sessions about how governments can be involved, and if you remember from the slide, there's 4 ways how they can be involved. Tell me what those 4 ways are. give me practical examples which are relevant to actually this assignment. And they're not going to do all of them, so tell me they could do this, but actually they're not going to. Why are they doing it? Show me on the diagram. Talk to me about the marginal cost and the marginal social cost. Talk to me about the curve, the marginal cost plus tax. Talk to me about what the impacts could be. It's a really big subject. Do go back and watch the videos if you've missed them. Do book a tutorial if you need to talk about things in more detail. But again, you've got several diagrams here you can do to illustrate it as well, but make it relevant to the topic. And finally, the guidance. Have you answered the question? Is it a case of market failure? And then conclude, it's worth 10%. And basically it's your thoughts about the research, but it's not the I's and the we's, it's not these personal thoughts. You're actually looking at the evidence you've drawn together, and you may be saying, well, from the research carried out, it looks likely that this will happen, or this could happen. So this is actually when you bring it all together. This is when I can see that you really understand what's happening. So we've used those percentages for how I market. All of these bullet pointed areas are things I'll be looking for and that time. And a suggestion for word count, and again it's worked on roughly the same percentages as I'm giving grades. You can go over by about 10%, and you see that by market failure I've actually put a little star by the word count, so if you do have spare words then use them in that section. Best of luck, and book a tutorial with me using the usual link if you want to discuss it, or bring along a draft and the notes. And again, I would suggest you do this sooner rather than later. Best wishes and good luck as you do this, and I hope the cuckooing clock and the striking clock wasn't too noisy, especially my wife came in to make me a cup of tea.